Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Edmundo Resendez. On today's Fronteras, we take a look at Latinos living in the U.S. and the challenges they face. Andres Garcia didn't let stereotypes or bullying stop him from learning English and succeeding in school after arriving in the U.S. at an early age. Here's his story.
My name is Andres Garcia, and I came to the U.S. when I was 9 years old. I didn't even know that they spoke English here. So on top of like the culture shock, the language was a huge barrier for me. Kids are kind of mean, so you know, it was just something that I had to like overcome at one point, and it was difficult. I mean, even my aunt didn't think that I was capable of, but I had the right support from both my parents, and on top of that, I had a really nice teacher who actually cared for me to learn English, so it's like got the motivation from them to learn English. And we all know the racial stereotypes, but you know, I just didn't listen to those stereotypes, and I kind of just believed in myself that I could do it.
So when I hear of the criticism of immigrants, it's always done in these stereotypes. The stereotypes are they're draining our resources, and they're taking American jobs. It's just not true. And then you see a real immigrant like Andres, and they destroy all those stereotypes. The narrative in the media, Trump, and many conservative people that are just scared of these immigrants taking their jobs. And the reality is, our immigrants are coming over and they're working their butts off. They're making this country better. They work hard, they're hungry, and I love holding up my students like Andres. I think that Andres has beat the odds, but I think many of my students do. Andres he works really hard. When Andres is in a classroom, he pushes everybody. He raises the bar, he raises the expectations, and plus he helps everybody around him. A lot of that is just who he is as a person, and a lot of that is what he's learned here, that I am my brother's keeper.
Over there in Mexico, they really don't see a vision for you. They just don't really push you or encourage you to like go to college. And what you have here, you have like stuff like Educare and YPI, and just the teachers in general, they're very supportive and that they care for education.
On today's Fronteras and Changing America, we explore mental health among Latinos in New Mexico and across the country. From stigma to treatment. Our guest is Fred Sandoval, Executive Director with NLBHA, the National Latino Behavioral Health Association. Fred, welcome to Fronteras.
Good to see you, Edmundo. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. It's been about 4 years since we last had you.
Oh my God, time flies, and
time flies.
Feels like just last year.
But it seems that the mental health among Latinos still exists.
It sure does, and it's a nice kind of retrospect for what has happened in the last 4 years, and so we get to talk about that today.
Okay, let's start the discussion by discussing stigmas in the Latino community regarding mental health.
You know, stigma is one of those kinds of issues that we tend not to think too much about. We don't tend to speak about it publicly or loudly in any community across the country. And in large measure, the reason why is because stigma is one of those things that you want to do to people when you really, in part, are trying to kind of perpetuate something about why you feel that you're better than others. And if you stigmatize others, it's a way of putting them down for who they are, their differences, or something about them that you want to stigmatize, which is to label them or stereotype them in ways that can be degrading, demeaning, and also to really to hurt people. And so stigma's still alive and well, and it certainly exists in the Latino community, but yeah, it's certainly something that creates a very significant barrier to getting mental health care in our country.
Well, let's explore stigma and talk about the stigma that exists in a multi-generation family versus a first-generation family.
Well, good point, because if you think about mental health, just the term mental health, it's a very European concept, right? Because it talks about the term mental, and the word mental has always been associated with the person's mind, and what is it about their mind and their psychiatry, if you will, about their psychology that quite frankly also scares people. So mental health and the mental word illness also has a very frightening terminology associated with it. But in terms of stigma and the way it's associated to it, it's always concentrated on those illnesses that for many people are very disturbing and perplex and unknown, because really in some ways these conditions such as schizophrenia or manic depression, what they refer to today as bipolar, and other types of characteristics or conditions, they're very frightening terms, not well understood. People oftentimes don't know what they mean, but if you associate it with one particular term, the word crazy, it's or loco, especially in the Latino community, what ends up happening is people close up very quickly. And with the Latino community, we're a very private community, meaning that we like to take care of our affairs in our families and in our communities. But if it's stigmatizing in nature, it gets even quieter than that. Que mi hijo está con una enfermedad. That's a little easier to talk about, but you would never say que mi hijo está loco, that my son is crazy, because then suddenly people will clam up and not want to have that conversation.
Let's talk about some of the challenges some of these first-generation families or recent arrivals to this country face. They face the struggles of having to cross a border and not knowing anybody in this country or knowing a minimal amount of people in this country. And a lot of times these folks are undiagnosed. They might have experienced mental health issues in their native country, and when they come here, they don't realize that they haven't, and in their journey to get here, face trauma. Coupled with mental health, they have PTSD as a result of what they've experienced in coming here. How do you find that these people deal with these issues?
Well, you have a variety of things that happen. It's a great question, Edmundo, because if you think about recent immigrants, we've found certain things tend to happen to them that's highly unusual. One is they come to the U.S. based on things that they're dreaming, things of conditions that'll be better for them and the things that they can aspire to. It's the natural human condition. We want things to be better for ourselves. The actual experience itself, however, is highly stressful, full of distress, duress, and in some cases, traumatic experiences. Just the experience of coming to the United States can cause that to happen. So you have those underlying conditions that people will arrive with because of what happens in the journey to migrate here. And I call it migrating because that's a human phenomenon. It happens across the globe. It's for people to migrate across, borders and countries and communities,
been happening
regions.
For millennia.
Yeah, it's been happening forever. So it's a human condition, right? But when you have experiences that affect your well-being, i.e. mental health, then part of what happens is then how do you deal with that? And everybody addresses their own stressors differently. So you have that phenomenon. And then the other one that we have is then you have something that's very unique to people who immigrate to the United States in general. The longer people stay in the United States, the worse their well-being becomes.
Interesting.
So think about this for a second. So people come here with the aspirations, dreams, and visions of things being better. Well, the one thing that actually does not improve is their mental health. So what ends up happening is they'll start to experience greater stressors, greater demands, and conditions that actually cause them to have more mental health related problems. So the longer you stay, the worse your health outcomes become. So it's a unique phenomenon. You have these two things, getting here, and then when you are here, those conditions then tends to get aggravated.
Well, let's talk about how they confront with these conditions. A lot of them have self-medicating, which is drinking or maybe even drug abuse.
Yeah, well said. So it's not unusual. And this is a phenomenon that particularly relates to migrant communities. Is what happens is there's a great deal of isolation in being a farm worker or a migrant worker because of the circumstances. You work in areas that are relatively remote, places where there's there's very limited opportunities in terms of economic, social, and other activities. But having said that, part of what happens, it's the phenomenon of being isolated, that suddenly between the isolation and now having new economic resources, well, guess what happens? You now will have dollars to spend, but where do you spend them? And where can you go if you don't have transportation to get there? So that isolation then suddenly gets aggravated because then you'll purchase alcohol. So it's not unusual for people to then purchase large quantities of alcohol, and what happens? A weekend full of, imbibing in alcoholic beverages. But those create new patterns. And you can see that those new patterns then start to have pretty significant effects on your well-being and your physical health. And so you have that isolation combined with new resources that over time aggravate their circumstances.
Well, let's talk about the kind of outreach that does or doesn't exist for these Latino communities to educate themselves about mental health and substance abuse.
Well, it's yet another great question, largely because, so the question is then how does anyone get information? And so if you're in a place where you're in a rural, remote, border, frontier, isolated area, you're going to have less access already. What we have found, and this is particularly truly across the border areas on both the U.S. and Mexico side, is much to the credit of the community health workers that are in this country, many of them who actually work for federally qualified health centers, and even for now, more recently, mental health centers. Community health workers are referred to as promotoras and promotores. Both men and women can play this role, but largely women. And what they do, which is pretty phenomenal, is they actually do health education in the communities, in the field, in the campus, where people live. So that means getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to be where people are getting ready to drive off into the fields. People have to gather, and they are there to hand out pamphlets and materials and to start letting their presence be known, that they're there to help share information for their well-being and for their family. And so that the next day when they come back, they can say, tienes cuestiones, tienes unas preguntas por nosotros, you have questions for us. And then they get to ask the questions. Then they come back with more information. It's creating trust,
It is creating
rapport,
trust.
and information sharing. Because when you're isolated, the thing that you don't have much of is information. If you don't have the information, then how can you be educated about anything having to do with alcohol consumption or food consumption, things that might, you need to kind of look at carefully. So I would say community health workers have been a mainstay in our country to really ensure better outreach because they physically go out there. In other words, we're not waiting for clients to come to the center. The outreach is going out there, reaching out and really connecting with people where they're at. That means in their work environments largely and in their homes. And with Latinos, that's particularly important, is because then they can feel the personalization of you knowing that you're there present with them, connecting, talking, so they can see you, they can connect with you. And that's invaluable because that bonding means it creates the opportunities for learning more about what can they do next.
How does your organization work with media, in particular social media, to help spread the word of these issues for people that might not have access to promotores?
Well, I tell you what, I have to tell you, probably 4 years ago, and I can say that was probably my own turning point, is realizing how much I underutilize social media as a professional. And while I've been in the field for a long time, and I call it in my age group, part of what's happened is we had to kind of catch up to the younger population who are very tech savvy and tech friendly. But I learned very quickly the benefits of that. It's a way of sharing information that people can read when they're ready to read it. People can see it when they're ready to see it. And it's them seeing the information personally and privately. So when they have their handheld device, it's them receiving information that's personal to them, private. So what you're not having to do is openly talk about these issues so that you don't.
It's a very subtle way of reaching out to
Yeah,
them.
it's a very powerful way because what happens is that, when I said at the beginning of the show, Latinos in particular weigh heavily and they value heavily this notion of privacy. And that privacy, when it's honored and respected, what it means is then they'll listen to the information because they don't have to feel any of the embarrassment or any of the criticisms or any of the judgments that are made about information sharing because it's private, it's personalized to them, and you can share that information in a way that's going to be well received. And here's the opportunities for, guess what? Learning what can I do different.
All right, I asked you this question 4 years ago, and I'm going to ask it again to see how far we've come with this. But with the explosive growth of Latinos in this country, our psychiatrists and therapists offer training to deal with Latinos.
Well, the way that question, I would answer it today, is some parts of the country do that better than others. And some universities or educational institutions do that far better than others. And then I would also say, taking it a step further, is we have some that do it so well that really they're the ones who can really lead this process and this kind of campaign, if you will, for how to more effectively and more culturally and linguistically appropriate address the issues that are unique to Latino communities. So for instance, I was in California recently, and the University of California at Davis, for instance, has done an excellent job of really ensuring that the disparities that Latinos face are better known, and known so that they can share that information. Because part of what they've done is, between the research and the academic work of that university, they've also become a center for addressing the disparities of Californios in that state, and now are a technical assistance provider to the state systems and the counties in that state to help address the issues for Latino mental health and their well-being. So that's an example of universities doing a really great job of that. You can also look to New Mexico State University and UTEP as a, for instance, in a more localized version of the things that these universities do far better than other parts of the country. And that's their work around border health issues. That means they live it, they know it, they're institutionalized here, and in some respects, the rest of the country would anticipate that they're a leader in that respect, and you have some good work being done here in this part of the country around border health study, border health research, and that's important because then what happens is it addresses the needs of the Latino population that are found in this part of the country. But you could also be in Chicago, you could also be in New York City, could be in Florida, and what you have is you have pockets of Latinos that have to be studied really from that perspective, because the needs of urban communities are vastly different than they are in rural areas like this.
Well, and the issue with Latinos, as we all know, is that you've got Latinos from Mexico, you've got Latinos from Cuba, from Puerto Rico. They all have different kinds of experiences when they come into this country in their assimilation into this country.
Oh, that's right. And interestingly enough, Mexicanos have a longer history of assimilation than many of the other groups for lots of reasons. One is because the U.S. is contiguous to Mexico, and this previously having been part of Mexico, part of what happens is you have populations that have been here for hundreds of years. And so the result is there's been more contact, and so there's been a different relationship between the U.S.-Mexico border than there have been, let's say, relationships with Puerto Rico or Cuba or Spain and other parts of Latin America, for that matter. So in the United States, the Mexican Americans, who make up probably 60% of the population of what we call Hispanics, means that they have had more frequent interaction, more exposure, constant contact with the United States for decades and hundreds of years. So what has been learned from that acculturation, that assimilation, is that one is, in the United States, the systems are vastly different. The policies are vastly different, which means is how they interact with Latino populations is different, because a first generation family, for instance, all this is new experiences versus, let's say, my family. My family's been here since 1498, so what do we think of? Well, we don't think of immigration in quite the same way because we were not immigrants here. We actually preceded the occupation of the Southwest. So what happens is anybody who came after that migrated here. So for us, our experiences are vastly different. So today, the conditions for Latino communities, whether it's from Guatemala or El Salvador or from other parts of the country, other parts of Latin America, their experiences are going to be met with a little bit different resistance today, because we're in a modern time where what's happening is there's a political environment and an economic environment that's vastly different today than it was even 4 years ago. And the things are a little bit different today than they were when we last met.
Okay, let's talk about the undocumented immigrant front. Is there any research that you've conducted or that has been conducted on how mental health may be affecting this community? And I'm talking in particular in the current political environment that we live in. It seems that, you know, within the last 2 years, there has been much discussion in the media regarding immigrants into this country. How is the immigrant community, how is the Latino community dealing with the current political environment?
Great question, and thank you for asking that question. I think, you know, the importance, I think, of the freedom of speech is the ability to speak to the issues that exist. And the issues that exist today and the policy and the political environment are vastly different today than they've been in many years. So thank you for the question. And what I would say is a couple of things to think about. In the last couple of years, our organization has done some work, particularly in California and certainly across the country, where we do behavioral health interpreter training. So the issue of language and limited English proficiency is part of the subject matter. And what we do is we train organizations on how to have their staff serve as interpreters for clients that they serve who are limited English proficient. And how do we assure that they have access to service? In order to have access to services, that means they have to have the language access capacity in the organization. The short of it is this: what we've learned in those last couple of years in particular is that there's been a major shift in our country in terms of access to services in general. And in large measure, it's really been affected by some of the major policies in the country, and there's policy shifts that have taken place and are taking place as we speak. Our organization actually started to hear quite a bit of angst, concerns, and really public expressions of fear about what's happening, because the effect it was having on the well-being, the mental health of Latino populations. And so it's something to pay attention to, because as an advocate organization, how do we then look at policy and how do we research it? And we actually undertook some time last year to really explore that issue. We started looking at two things. One is, what are the current immigration policy issues that are taking place in the country, particularly as they relate to Latino immigration? And then the other is to look at what is the history of mental health research around what happens to immigrant populations, particularly who are experiencing a change in their mental health, such as increased anxiety, increased depression, increased sleeplessness, an increase in traumatic experiences. And all I could say is we found that the biggest concern that the Latino community has been expressing very openly, very publicly, is that the effect it has been having on children. Because children who are born in the United States as citizens then are now being adversely impacted through no fault of their own about something that's happening to their parents, which is those individuals who are then now under the duress, the pressure, the isolation of being exposed to potential detention and deportation, which is taking place. It's been taking place for a number of years now, so it's not a new phenomenon, except in the last 4 to 6 years there's been greater emphasis on it. So it's really had a dramatic impact on our families and the kids in particular, because when the parents are extrapolated out of the country, the children are left exposed to the systems and the communities in ways that not only are they vulnerable, but their mental health is being affected and changed. And without proper intervention, these children will actually go on without untreated interventions. And that's a big concern for us. From a policy perspective, we're finding that there's an increase in the fear that's taking place in our country. And examples of what that means is when people are fearful, they come out of their homes less often. That means they're not out in public driving to get access to bank services or to take their kids to school, even to go to work. And so what's happening is it's creating greater isolation, which creates increased duress and distress. And then when people sometimes do leave, they run the risk of then being exposed to things such as deportation. And just recently, and I'll give this as an anecdotal example, this wasn't part of our research, but in Santa Fe, New Mexico, for instance, we have reports of the ICE agents now using force in a much more aggressive fashion. Force is not unusual in the enforcement industry, but what's different is now, guess what? When you pull out the gun from your holster, then having that as part of the enforcement process changes and traumatizes the individuals in a very different fashion, right? So for anyone who's ever experienced violence, right, it's one thing to be physically assaulted. When you have a physical assault combined with the use of armaments, weapons, guns, it dramatically impacts people's experiences. And that type of trauma, without it getting resolution, and which it generally won't, because the environments are there not for purposes of your mental health or your well-being. It's really there to force a change in controlling the person. And so it's been happening in ways that are very concerned to us.
What message do you have on behalf of your organization to reach out to these Latinos to give them a sense of hope?
Well, you know, a great way of looking at this, because on the other hand, is how do you contrast these experiences? One is continuing to send information out. about supporting individuals who, through no fault of their own, are really trying to abide by the laws of the country, right, in light of the criticisms about their being here illegally. And the hope message in that is that, one, is that these political conversations and political dialogue still have to run their course. And that the hope is that people with better judgment and rational thinking can understand a country made up of immigrants, in fact, have always at the end demonstrated a better grasp for policy that's in the best interest of human and civil and constitutional rights. Because in the United States, what has always won out is, as a country that's ruled by law, is we recognize that your civil rights, constitutional rights, and the rights of individuals should always take precedence, despite the political jargon of the time. And so we have that to look forward to, that a democratic process has always prevailed in our country. And all I can say is that's a hopeful message, and that we support them, and to recognize that there is yet more work to be done around these policy issues.
Fred Sandoval, I want to thank you very much for joining us on Fronteras, Changing America.
It's great to see you. What can I say? I hope to see you again, of course.
Okay, we'll be happy to have you. Thank you for joining us on Fronteras, Changing America. I'm Edmundo Resendez.